guess we can get started. I don't know what time it is. It's 11:11. Looks like we can get started. I think it's supposed to start at 11:15. This is a pretty, can be complex, and you probably have a lot of questions. So we'll just start. My name is Marvin Oey. Been doing Drupal development for a while, on and off. Work for Acquia, and my first time here at BADCamp. The way I've sort of set this presentation up is it's more hands-on. Configuration management is one of those topics where you can talk about it, but you won't really fully understand it until you actually see things happening, and more importantly, see things go wrong, which I'm sure something will happen when I'm doing this. Something's going to go wrong, and we'll figure it out together. But before we get started, and me talk about the overview, I wanted to get a sense of the audience and see, what kinds of things you were looking for. So how many of you, the context of this is all going to be Drupal 8, so it's not really going to be related to Drupal 7. Is that okay with everybody here? Cool, okay. And then at the same time, how many of you, just show of hands, have actually played around with configuration management? Awesome. How many of you loved it and just fully understood it right off the bat? Second thing I wanted to understand is how are you all using configuration management now? And I'll give two answers for that. Those of you that are using it for development workflow, can you see a raise of hands? Okay. The other one is non-development, but that's what I'm not sure. How are the rest of you, if you don't mind sharing, using configuration management now? Is it just like capturing sort of certain settings so you can go back to it, or some other sort of?
We use it for dev workflow, but we don't keep separate ones yet.
You don't keep separate ones
so
from?
Our dev and live is just the same.
Okay. So you haven't?
We haven't used it split.
This config split. Okay, so great. That's a good segue into what I'm going to start off with is just sort of the basics, just to make sure we're on a level playing field between what configuration management is versus content. Because that's usually an area of confusion, and you'll see strange errors, and we'll see that today. I've kind of set it up so that it actually shows some of that gray area and what can happen with that. And then I want to kind of go up a level and start talking about simple configuration management, which is what was just mentioned now. You've got configuration management, you're capturing it, but it's kind of the same throughout all of your environments. And then lastly, we'll go into, I call it workflows here, but it's more advanced, which is essentially config split and config ignore and filters and things like that and setting it up. And then we'll just kind of go through that. And then if we have time, we can go into some specific use case scenarios and just have a discussion and maybe try out some different things that you might be interested in or have questions around. Does that sound all right for everyone? Perfect. So content versus configuration. Obviously, content is going to be that information. Let me take a step back. So there are, I think, 4 types of information that Drupal 8 captures. Content, configuration, caching, I think, and then sessions. So those are the 4 sort of types of information that it captures. We're only going to concentrate on content and configuration. Content being, your nodes, articles, things that you create. Like content managers would typically touch. And then there's configuration, which is information that typically isn't changed that often. So like if you go to administration and you change the site name or the slogan, things like that, those are configuration. And again, it gets kind of gray in this sense. But typically, you'll be capturing things in Drupal 7, it was called features. But here, because it's all configuration, mainly you'll capture stuff like views, like all the advanced views that you create. Maybe some blocks, and we'll talk about sort of the gotchas in blocks. And then other sort of config entities like rules and things like that can be captured in there. And I'll show how we can see whether something was captured or not on that. So I keep mentioning gray areas. So a really good example is custom blocks. Right? You create a custom block, you can create one pretty easily. You just go to the blocks, add a new block, and you can start putting things in there. Well, what happens is you're actually doing 2 things in there. You're actually doing configuration, because you're going to have to place that block somewhere in a region, which is configuration. And then there's the content of the block itself, which is when you create that block, you're going to put some content in there, just like you would with any node or entity. So as I mentioned, block placement is configuration, which is going to be captured by the configuration management system or configuration system, but the content itself isn't. And so content's not typically out of core captured in configuration, but there are a lot of contrib modules that are starting to sort of allow you to put node or content information as config. It's a lot of files if you have a lot of them, but there are now ways to do that. And that's one of the beauties of Drupal 8 is that sort of modular approach where you can hook in. When you have these gray areas, the result is you're going to get stuff like this, where you get, broken block handlers, you get these weird messages on your layouts and pages and things like that. And we'll see sort of that happen today. So I call these demos really hands-on, just kind of showing you what I just talked about now. We're actually going to go into a site, and we're going to make some configuration changes on that site. I'm going to use Umami, since how many of you are familiar with Umami or played around with it. So that's a good one to just kind of play around because it's got some pre-configured content in there. And then we're going to export those changes that we have into a tar.gz. So we're going to use strictly right now just the Drupal UI, basically what Drupal core provides. We'll then reset the site. So I've got like a database dump, and we'll just reset everything. And then we'll use the configuration that we exported out and import it in to see what happened. And that's when we're going to see some of the errors and things like that. So, and then lastly, we'll discuss what happened and go over some questions that you might have. So with that, let's go ahead and look at, I think I have already reset this. So I'm logged in as an administrator. We won't go through that. Oh, wait. See, there's the message that you're going to see. So I kind of jumped ahead. We'll reset this right now real quick. And I think I'll put it.
Do you have a way to reset your contrast? Really hard to see.
Oh.
Maybe you've got light over the.
There's no dim, they just all go off. We can try,
Yeah.
but
Oh,
there's that.
sorry.
Oh.
It's so dark. Yeah, I don't.
That's fine.
Is that all right?
Okay, or
That's fine.
I'll be a switch operator.
That's fine.
Yeah, sorry about that. Let's see. So I'm basically, what I'm doing is I've got some aliases set up, simulated environments in here. I use Drupal VM. I think there's a session on local environments. We can talk about that. But I've got some things set up. So I've got aliases set up, and I've got some database snapshots that I created that's going to allow me to sort of reset some of this stuff. Second. So I'll understand the difference between what I'm doing now and like a configuration import. Just as we're waiting on this, what I'm doing now is I'm actually taking a database snapshot, which is similar to what configuration does, but it captures it in YAML files. But the issue with this approach is that if you're on different environments, you might have people actually creating content. So when you try and dump something onto a live site, you're going to be you're basically overwriting that database. So any content that's being created will be lost. So let's see. All right. Let me clear the cache. So we've now got a completely reset. This is as if I just installed Umami on the site itself. And we've got a couple of things in here that looks on that. First thing we'll do is we'll change a little bit of the configuration, which is I'm going to change the banner to a one that's for BADCamp or something like that. So it's pretty straightforward. You would go into structure, go to block layout, and add a block. So in this case here, oops. Custom block, and we'll add a banner block here, call it BADCamp. And then a URL, BADCamp. I think I've got an image already in here. So we've now got our banner block. It's not placed anywhere on the page yet, so we can go ahead and lay that out. Structure, we'll click on block layout, and we'll place it in the banner. So now we're doing configuration. So we created content. So my act of creating that block was content. And now I'm going to add that custom block, oops, which I don't remember what I called. And we will display the title, and we'll save that. I'll go ahead and drag that up so that it's there and save it. And we now have changed our site up a little bit here. So you've got, that banner, and then underneath it is still there. And let's go ahead and just remove this second banner down here, just to add a few more changes to it. And save those blocks. So now we've made our changes. Oh, I forgot to save it. But it's taking slow, and it looks like it's going fast. So what I'll do now is just go into the configuration. So this is what comes out of Drupal course, just out of the box. If we go to configuration, you'll see in the development section, you'll see this configuration synchronization. So through the UI, you can already start importing and exporting things out. So in here, I'm going to export my current configuration or active configuration that's captured in the database right now. It'll give it a file name. So it'll look like this, and it's basically a tarball. And we'll save that. Go back to the page, and so now we've captured our changes in configuration. What we'll do now is reset the site again and import those configurations. But remember that whole gray area piece that was in there, and you'll see kind of what happens in that sense. This. So literally I'm just dropping the database, deleting it, and then I'll just replace it back with our start snapshot. So it is reset. As you can see, it went back to the way it was. Our banner is now gone from there. And I only did one change, which is just a block. But say we did create a couple of views and things like that, and we kept our configuration. It's a lot of things that you could capture. It's straightforward. You go back to the configuration. Come to that menu, and at this point we can import. So in this import, we'll choose that file that was exported out, which in this case I think was this one. Yeah, 1124, and then we'll open that up and we'll upload it. And here's that block configuration that was captured. We can look at what's happening. So it provides a little view, active stage, not much, and import that all. So you can see that there was some errors in here because it's missing, it should be missing some of the stuff in there. So if we refresh it, and because the content wasn't there, the error's not showing up on this sense because I don't think I cleared out the database right. But essentially, we now have that content configuration placement, but Drupal doesn't know where that content is because it doesn't exist. So if we went into our structure, we should see it in here.
I think it actually didn't import it. There was an error message.
Yeah.
Oh, was there an error message? Did I go through too fast on that? Hold on one sec.
It said it already had something with that machine name.
Oh. Let's see. Let's check out what the error was. Am I importing the right one? 1124.
In case of the view difference.
Oh, it looks like there's my entity already exists in there, which means I probably didn't do a good snapshot. So let's do this real quick. Doesn't exist in there. Fun times. So let me try doing one of my other configs. So this is one that I did earlier. I must have done something wrong when I just saved it, or it didn't save it right. Maybe I clicked too quick and it didn't create the right files. And we'll import that. And in this configuration, what I also did was I enabled a couple of modules as well, which was captured in the configuration. And once it's all configured, you'll see actually the admin, this toolbar is actually going to change because I enabled it. So I enabled that admin toolbars, which provides this drop down. And then we'll go back to the site here. And we've got this BADCamp. So I must have done something when I was exporting that configuration out, or something when it was saving, it may have not captured it right. And it did that. But this is sort of the same sort of situation where you've got the BADCamp 2019, but it's missing that content. So there are a couple of modules that you can add that will allow basically the Drupal that you're basically importing the content into to generate that content for you. But it'll be a placeholder, and then you've got to cut and paste those pieces on there. So that's a very simple approach to actually importing, just using the Drupal UI. But those are rare cases. That's just sort of if you're trying to save some different configurations and pulling them in. Let me stop there and see if you have any questions on what just happened. I know it's kind of confusing with that corrupted config file that I just created. Does that make sense? Did that help clear anything?
Yeah, I'm just curious, is anything being kind of, like you mentioned, like I've used the block placeholder module where they used to kind of reserve that machine name. Is anything being done to kind of fix this? Like, it seems like this is pretty broken out of love.
Yeah, so there are discussions, and right now there's like a debate on, well, content shouldn't be in config, only basically the placement of it should be in there. But there's like that broken piece of it on there. The fix around it is typically, in most cases, you wouldn't be exporting or putting places out there with using custom blocks. You'd create that custom block using a module. Then that gets captured in configuration, and you'll have that module again. You can place it around.
Right, but I mean, sometimes the user just wants to kind of place content on the line.
Yeah, it is challenging. There's another module out there called entity as config. That works pretty well, but then you've got two stages that you've got to go through. You've got to make sure you export that content as config, and then include that in a module that installs it. So this kind of goes beyond the configuration method of this, what I was going to talk about. But you'll have that install directory inside of a custom module that has the config YAMLs in there. And when you enable it, it'll add that to your configuration, and then you'll have access to those. The key thing is the UUIDs on there, and making sure those are in. Sometimes you'll strip those out, and then the UUIDs won't match because the config will capture that. So those are some gotchas when you're creating those pieces like that. Good question, though. Now, one of the key things that configuration management was designed for was to help the workflow approaches to this. I'm going to start off with just the simple workflow, which is similar to what we just saw. Let me see how we're doing on time. It's already 33 minutes. I may skip the simple one and just jump into config split, because I think that's going to be a more beneficial thing because that's what typically you're going to be doing. So let me kind of explain how I've got everything set up here for the demo. What I've done is typically you're going to have, whether you're on some hosting service or your own on-prem servers, you'll have various environments. So you may have, Kubernetes, and you've got different containers with your different sites on them. You'll have dev, stage, production, Pantheon, Acquia. We all have our different sort of setups, and each of those environments are going to have, basically environment variables, so that we can pull out what environment a site particularly is on. And I'll go over some of the code that exists in the settings.php file. In this case here, all I've done is I've just created a multi-site with one code base. Each of these different sites are basically using the same code base, but in the settings.php file, I just add a variable in there to show, hey, this is development, this is production, just to sort of simulate that. The way I kind of set that up is each of these URLs is pointing to a different directory which has that settings in there, and that's sort of how I kind of distinguish between the three. And then I've got aliases set up for those, so we can kind of go through that pretty quickly. One thing I wanted to note out is essentially in your settings.php file, the default one that comes with Drupal core will have some comments. This is just a short piece of it, but if you search for config sync in there, you'll come to this line, and it's commented out at first. When you uncomment it, you can basically define the location of your sync file. It's an array, so that means you can actually have multiple config directories and have multiple config exports out in those. And we'll see a little bit of that as we go into that. The default config sync directory constant that's defined in Drupal core is the one that goes to the sync, which means when I was in the configuration UI and I exported or imported, it's going to import and export out of the directory that's defined in here. So in this case, it was saving it in this config workflow sync. So what we'll do right now real quick is we're going to make some changes. Actually, I'm going to skip this because this is the simple workflow. So let me go to the advanced. So now that you kind of understand how I've got that set up, and I'll walk through the different pieces of that, we're going to talk about the config split and how it works. Basically, what config split allows you to do is basically create different configuration splits based on different parameters or conditions. The three most common ones is environment splits, which are dev, stage, production, or whatever environments that you might have. Profile splits, which is if you have an advanced situation where you're hosting many different sites and they're using different profiles, you can actually split out the config for each of those. And then individual site splits. Now, the best practice is to pick one or the other. As soon as you start mixing and matching, you're going to have a pretty complicated directory structure for your configuration splits. And then it's just hard to track and keep going. So one of the key things is as you start identifying your particular project, typically you'll want to start off with an environment split and then combine that with either a profile or a site split. But having all three of them at the same time will get confusing because then you'll have some people mess up and they'll put an environment split where the next level is sites and then inside of the sites are the profiles, or you'll have profiles and then you can have sites. So it just depends on how you want to do that. And then there's one other situation with the other splits where, again, it's all directory structure based and how you have that. But as you'll see in a little bit, when it does split out the configuration, it literally splits the files out. So then it's hard to kind of figure out what exactly it's doing at that point. How the splits work, so once you enable the config split module, it's going to turn a few things on in your settings so that things happen when you're doing drush commands. But all of your splits are going to be created within the Drupal UI, and we'll see that. The split definitions, when you start creating them, it's important to identify the physical location of where they're going to be located. We'll go through that. And how config split module finds that directory structure. The help documentation kind of leaves a little bit of that out, so it created some problems for some folks. So as an example, in this case, we're going to actually put our config splits in config envs, or environments. And then these are just other examples of how you would set that up. And it can go deeper and deeper into those. So this is, I'm going to demo an environment split scenario. So dev versus production. And here's sort of the scenario where typically when you're doing local development, you're going to want things like dblog and devel turned on so you can see messages that are coming. However, when you go to production, you don't want those modules turned on. You don't ever want devel or dblog being turned on in production for performance reasons and security reasons as well. So in production, in this case, I created a module called BADCamp, which doesn't do anything. It's just a module with the info.yaml in it. But the idea is sometimes in production, you may have an API integration, right, that is going to be connecting out, but your local machine may not be able to access those sites or something like that. So you don't want that particular module turned on. So in this case, in production, the team needs the BADCamp turned on and the syslog modules turned on because you want syslog to be able to parse certain things out. And here's how we'll actually do that, and here's what I'm going to show. We're going to first enable the config split module. We'll create two config splits, development and local or production, and then I'll show you how the setup of the splits are going to be with the environment and how basically that configuration kind of sets up. So creating the splits. Remember, it's all done through the UI, so you actually have to enable that config split module first. So we go in. So this is my development environment site, and I just found a theme that looked a little bit different, and I installed that. So if we go into here, we've already got some of the things already turned on in here. Let me actually reset that. So what I'll do is flush. So let me check and make sure that was all dropped. Okay. So we've got a blank slate. I'm going to go ahead and install basically so we can start from scratch. And as that kind of dumps in, anyone have any questions or any confusion around what you've seen so far while we wait on that? How many of you have actually played with config split? Or you as it now? Are you finding it challenging, or is there anything specific that you are?
I mean, basically what I've ended up doing is for like having multiple developers working on the site. First of all, we're putting all the config into the install profile, because that seems to be the only way to kind of easily just for everybody if they're not aware, like when you do a site installation, the site needs to assign an ID, and every installation has to have the same ID, otherwise the config won't import. That's my understanding, right?
Yeah, so what you're doing is you're putting in your profile when it installs it in the install
yeah, I think
config,
that
it
was
has all
something
the.
they added 2 versions ago that you could install from configuration instead of a profile. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and then we're using just environment variables depending on the installation to kind of switch between those configs.
Oh, so you've got like a production profile
Yeah, we
and
have
a
production, staging, and development kind of splits.
Okay. So we've reset everything, and we're starting from scratch, which means config split's shouldn't be turned on this. So we'll go ahead and check and see. Let's set up 0. So config split is not turned on. So the first thing you'll want to do is turn that on. And I'm just going to use drush to do that. So just go drush. And we'll turn on config split and config ignore. If you do just config split, it'll turn it on, but I'm just going to do that. And then I'm going to turn on one other thing because it just makes it easier. The admin toolbar. So now that that's turned on, we can go to development and look at the configuration split settings. So this is where you start defining your different config splits. So this is the UI I was talking about. We're going to add our first config split setting, which is going to be for our development environment. So we'll add that, and you just give it a label. Development config. And this is the important piece here, and this is what trips a lot of people up, is that the machine name needs to be the name of the directory of the config location. Has to be the same. So I'm gonna make it easier and say just dev. You can put a description in there, and this is the folder that's going to be put in. It's relative to the Drupal root directory. So whatever the index.php file is, that's the relative root that's going to be on. And typically you want it to be outside. You want your config outside of that. So you go // which means go up one level. Config, envs, and then dev. So again, this is the important piece. This dev piece needs to be the same as your machine name. Otherwise, it can't find it, and you'll get all these weird errors. We'll go ahead and save that. And then we'll do the same thing for prod. So we'll say production. Here already, and then make sure we change this to prod. So now you've got your splits set up in the UI. The second step is you have to make sure those directories actually exist on the server itself. So we'll go into the server and just make sure they're there. So this is my repository, how it's set up. The doc root is where the Drupal root is. So if I go into doc root here, for those of you, some people may be used to web when it gets installed as web. So here's the sites, the modules. So this is your Drupal root. We're going to go up one level, and then go to config. We can see we do have a config directory already created. And I do have an envs directory set up. And then if we go into that, we should have our dev and prod. So we've got our dev and prod. So everything is all set and ready to go at that point. The next thing that we want to make sure we do is, already went over that. Oh, I don't have it in here. Is this piece here. So the way config split works, and we're doing a complete split, not a configuration, like a conditional one. Basically what it's going to do is you're going to select certain modules with certain settings that it's going to pull out of the default. So we're using devel, dblog, BADCamp, and syslog. So when we create our config splits, you want to make sure all of those are enabled first when you start creating them. So let me show you the reason why. If we come into edit, let's do our development environment right now. And we've got our complete split. This used to be called blacklist, which means add everything except for the modules and configuration items that you've identified to the sync, the standard default sync directory. Don't include these ones. Put that in a separate directory, which would be these here. And it'll figure everything all out for you. But if you come in here, we do have database logging, which is the DB log, but we don't have syslog, and we don't have the BADCamp module that I've got in there. So we need to enable all those first so that it can capture that in here. I'm going to go ahead and just do that in using Drush again. So we're going to enable the 4 modules that we want to do our configuration splits with. So we'll just enable those. And now if we refresh this page, we've got our BADCamp custom module that we want, but we don't want that turned on our development split or development environment. But we do want devel or devil, and we want database logging. So we select those two, and we save that. So that's now set. It's got those 2 modules in there. And then for our production, we know that we want the BADCamp module, syslog. So we've got those 2 selected. So syslog is selected, and BADCamp is selected, and we'll save that. So now everything is pretty much all set up in terms of our config splits for our different environments. So we've created our dev split, we've created our production split. Now we actually do the exports where it's going to change everything up. So let's take a look at what's in them right now first. So let me go to cd dev. And I've already got some configuration in here already because I just ran this. I'm going to remove it all so that it looks, so you can kind of, it's empty. And then we'll do the same thing with prod. And then just like any normal drush command, you'll run drush. Do a CEX, configuration export. It's going to ask you what directory location is going to be in. I have a couple that were in there. So sync is always going to be the default. So we'll just use the sync. It's going to give you the standard stuff on what has changed. So we changed the DB log settings. We enabled it. The devil settings changed. Views, there's certain things that turned on when we enabled those. And then we'll just say yes. Here's sort of the catch on here is that it looks like nothing happened just now. But because you have config split turned on, it actually did the split, which means if we now go back to our directories, when we go into our configuration for dev, you'll see that config split automatically took the DB log and devil and then whatever it needed to into that separate directory. And then in the sync, it kept all the other stuff in there. Similarly, in prod, it did the same thing as well. And in that case, because we have everything already enabled, because it's already a default sync, it knows, okay, but if we added a few other things in there that wasn't set up that way, then it will start capturing it in this split as well. So now let's go ahead and see what that looks like on the two environments on there. So to the site and so my BADCamp.com, this is the production site, which as you can see doesn't have devel or anything turned on. It's all sort of set up, and if we actually go into the extend, BADCamp isn't turned on. I think syslog is already turned on. Oh no, it's not turned on also. So if I've got everything set up properly, I could actually go to configuration. I do have to make sure that the site has config split turned on. That's the one thing that doesn't capture, so let's check and make sure that's turned on. It's not turned on. So on all the sites, that you have to manually turn on yourself. Obviously, if it's config split, it's not going to know to turn itself on. So we'll go ahead and just turn those two on real quick through here, through the interface. Just install
So
it.
you imported it when you the imposing part of the configuration. Because the configuration display is a part of your configuration, enabling these modules.
He doesn't know to look for it. It's not in that split.
It's not in split, but it's not in the main one either.
I thought it was
Oh, did I export? Oh yeah, you're right.
yeah, in the
You're right.
list, it was the couple split. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
That shouldn't have been in the main.
It should be in the main one, in the sync that I put that in. Yeah, you're right. Actually, let's try that. Let's turn that off real quick and see what happens.
And also,
Let's check and make sure those are turned off. Let's refresh that. So we've got those turned off. Oh, config filter is still on. Let me go turn that off also just to. So everything's turned off, and you don't need to use the the command line. You can actually do it directly from the import. So we can basically synchronize through here. Oh yeah, you're right. It did capture in that name because it shows up in here. And then we'll basically import them all. And we can actually see it happening. It's actually installing our config splits. Syslog was turned on. I didn't see BADCamp yet. It's uninstalling dblog. So BADCamp is enabled because we're on our production site. And then obviously our config splits are turned on, and then our syslog should be turned on in core. Database logging is turned off. And syslog is turned on. So let's do the same thing in our development environment. And it would be the same process. We could come in and go to development and go to configuration. Oh, in this case, we've already turned all that stuff off anyway in here. So let's check and see. So DB logging is already turned on. Syslog should be turned off. So actually, there aren't any in here, so it's not importing that in. Let me check and see if I have my conditions set up. So here's the condition that I set up for my development environment, which was just this environment variable I call BADCamp environment, so DEV. And what it does is it checks for the following. BADCamp env, and this condition where if it's the development environment, we're going to turn on our config split for development, and then for production, we're going to set that to false, so it won't pull those in. And then I've got this else statement for other conditions in here if you wanted to do that. But I don't have that local split set up. So it isn't pulling that in. So let's change a few things and see if it'll catch those config splits in there.
I have a question. Is there any way to like export like specific pieces of config? Like, so you want to enable config split on multiple sites, but you know, how would you do that? Because if you export the module list, you'll get, you know, that site's module list, and you can't really do that.
Yeah, so I kept it pretty high level where config split in here. So that's just the module piece, but in the configuration items, you can select the specific ones that you have turned on. Now, then it becomes sort of a manual process. So you know you want these specific configs turned on. So if I kind of clicked on those,
Yeah.
those would get split out into that environment. So let me just go ahead and turn those on. You'll see.
Well, I'm saying if you wanted to transplant, you know, like turning on the config module in different sites, not the same one.
Then you would have to create a new one. So that's the site splits. So you could create specific site, and you can say site 1, and then you identify it in here. So you could basically say, now that would actually be devel, for example, the devel environment. It was like some specific one that you put in there. And then really it's the system.
So does then there will be another directory under like
Yes.
sites and
So
sites?
each one would have their own. So you would have this specific configuration set up for it. You would save that. And now that we've got this site 1, we have to do the same thing that we did before. We come in
Okay.
and you define that. Oh, I don't think I didn't give a location. So in this case, we could say config sites, site 1. And it is site 1 here. Save that.
Including the configuration for site specific, it's could be a little bit challenging because there's a video
Yeah.
config files, so unless you remove it all. When
Yeah.
you try to export, that's not an issue. You import it from one side where
Yeah.
the configuration is created other side, and you're bringing it into it. Unless
Yeah.
you remove the UUID, it's going to.
Yeah, I haven't encountered that problem.
Oh, good.
Yeah. No, I mean, what I was hoping to get is like, so we have a bunch of sites that have branched off kind of like a main install profile. And then some of the sites have went in and done their own configuration to like specific views in that. So then how do I, as like the kind of main manager, push out like an update to all the views? You can't just go say, you know, it will give you the whole view as a whole, but you can't say, I want it to be able to add a filter so people can sort by date now. Because then it would wipe out their other changes, like their personal sortings for the lists or stuff like that.
So,
So it's really kind of like a step further, not just the modules, but like the specific settings in a view, or like maybe there is another setting for adding a field to switch to a different vocabulary for the certain site, or whatever.
so you can't actually use that. You can't actually use config split with that.
Oh.
The trick with that is, let's say for example, like views will come with, I think, depending on how complex it is, you could have maybe 6 or 7 views, YAML
Yeah.
files for that specific view or display in that. You could copy that set.
Yeah.
You just have to make sure that you get all of them. Put that in this site directory. Right now it's empty. Alter it in there. So, so essentially, you could do an export off of the existing site in its own directory.
And then
Copy those ones and put it inside of the specific directory, and that gets pushed out. Now, that would mean though you would have to do it on all of the
Yeah.
sites, right?
But it would also override, say, if someone had, you know, their filter or the sort by alphabetical first name, and this site is alphabetical by last name. So then, you know, the first site will then become sorted by first name as well instead of the original last name.
So actually, I have a similar case. So basically, I think that one of my test points will use different displays.
Okay.
So you can turn it on like using the displays for particular site you want to use has to be specific. So you can change whatever that won't affect other views. So you can make as many displays in the views, all the fields that you need. So you can tweak whatever you need for specific pages that capture the configuration. They don't affect the other the display in the view. There might be one. I don't. Yeah, there might be one.
Yeah, but then, so like, say the sort was supposed to be for everyone, no matter what display they have. So if I create another one, I have to then, it's still the same problem where the original page won't get the sort or the original view that they currently have on the site. I would have to change to the other display.
Yeah, you would have to change
Yeah.
individually to those sites to make
Yeah.
sure that. So in that use case, is the idea to keep certain settings on each of the sites
Yeah.
as is?
As is, while pushing your own specific settings.
Settings on that. Okay, so in that case, you wouldn't use config split.
Okay.
I forget the module that one of my colleagues created, and it's called. I'll find out. Let me search for it and I'll find out. Basically, what it does is it does a shallow merge of config, meaning you just create a YAML file for that view,
Yeah.
and you add it in a custom module. So that custom module would then be included in all basically in the code base.
Okay.
When you enable that module, and then you use config split to enable it on all the sites, and you can do that. That once it's installed, what it does is it takes existing config, it merges in
Okay.
that piece, and it overwrites. If it doesn't exist in that file, it doesn't overwrite anything else. It just changes whatever's in there. And it's basically a shallow merge of arrays.
Oh, yeah.
Features does that as well. It's a little bit different on features because I don't think features does it through config. I haven't played around with features too much, but that's what we use because we have the custom. Basically, it just makes it really easy. You just have a custom module with those YAML files in there, and it merges in all that.
I have a question. So you have all this config for dev, production, whatever. What if you wanted to do module development? You wanted to iterate your modules and then sharing the same modules on that site. How would you split that up? So like say, like you could have a separate module enabled on the other site, but if it's the same module, you're just changing it in some way, but you don't want it to affect production.
Settings of that particular module?
No, just like changing the module itself, like you're making a custom module.
Oh, you're making a custom module, but it's not enabled on live yet.
Right, you don't want those changes to be enabled on live, so how would you make it separate if it's in the same code base, the same install?
Oh, wait, I don't quite understand.
So you couldn't do that? You couldn't do like module development with this split system? Is that?
Oh no, so config split, all it really does is manages configuration. So you could have it enabled on development environments if you're having someone test it.
Right.
But on production, you would make sure that in your configuration that module is disabled, so that until it's ready to be turned on, and then you would alter that.
There would be another command. One of the developers will it's ready and merge, tested it, and then one of the core extension file in the configuration will be listed your modules ready to production, will be added to there.
So the dev version of the module could be like a different name, and then that could be disabled that way.
Yeah, you're talking about more development workflow,
Yep.
I think.
Right.
So you can have basically you can start pushing like that custom module.
Yeah.
Well, how do you do it now? I guess maybe I could take a step back and see like how would you do it?
I'm actually primarily working in Drupal
What
7
do you
right now.
do every time you
Okay. So in Drupal 7,
And I
so
have like
you.
totally separate installs for the separate sites.
Oh, I see what you mean. So you've got like production has totally different code base than your development environment. That's interesting.
Yeah, views are pretty tricky, right?
Yeah.
We have one.
I mean, you could do it right. You just have a different name for the module that's in development versus production. Just change the name if you want to push it out to development.
Whatever it was for the.
Into production, yeah, and have the configuration. Once they enable it, that configuration would be captured in that
Yeah.
split itself.
To be displayed differently, but not based on their.
Oh, I think that makes sense.
Not,
Yeah.
not based on
I
their.
have a question.
As they want
Do you have any suggestions what to do when getting sensitive conflict?
Your opinion,
than
more like the opinion.
The
And first time we saw the one
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
where it was hard, so we
Do you have a
picked like
solution
one second
other than
So
conflict?
then here we realized that's actually easier to use. So when they comes one person, we don't have to worry about it. It's a lot. We have kind of like 8 and then so one of the specific ones like so you have like 12 of them. And at the end like there was so when they comes back or fire, we want to change this one for this and that and we fix it. So capture it. So actually there was that. It was a little bit vague too.
Yeah. It's just.
Because when you do that, when you change something, for example, you change
because it would be.
any of the filters, sometimes you make sure that it doesn't affect the
Yeah.
which is a lot of make sure that you check.
Yeah. Yeah, we have
Is it
like
a
a
custom
bunch of
one?
department sites.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
which,
that
what do you do?
UCSF.
Oh, you do, okay.
So like we have everyone based on the same structure, but then it's like they want little specific changes. Like like I said, like maybe like first name for this site, last name for this site.
So,
Then
are you
you want
the
like
change
something
like that.
Yeah.
Like that's another thing.
How
Now,
do you
so they
manage
make
the
a
multi-site?
change.
Are you in the obvious site factory?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
factory, and then for then we have like 32 like custom sites. So so there are separate installs for each and like their own databases, so that if they ever want to do something completely different and not stay with us, they can go and do that.
Yes.
So we left them the flexibility.
So how is your, like, when you
But there's
upgrade
no
your
indication.
code, like, for version of something,
Um,
because of the multi-site,
yeah.
how is your book?
Now-
I mean, it's still
You would
core, so
primarily
just the
know-
composer update.
So,
Did you
no,
create
so
a
is your whole site, so how many total sites
Yes.
are
And then that it's like
What you
Oh,
could
so your
do
downtime is not too bad,
Yeah,
be about
is
like,
utilize-
2 hours at
Yeah.
most, right?
well,
Not even, it's faster, it's not faster.
I mean,
Tons of
we don't really have downtime just because
Oh, no, I'm talking about when you like will spec, someone might make sure that, no.
Oh, someone.
Yeah, I
Oh,
mean,
okay,
like-
no turnover time. sheet.
Turn-
Fine, they
yeah, but,
take
yeah,
check, yeah.
next.
But
We,
maintenance
I
would be
mean,
kind of an issue.
we tell them to check because we don't know, we can't check every
So
site.
it's
So we,
pretty smooth, that, like,
Yeah.
upgrade the cores with the site factory,
Stop
right?
using
Yeah.
features, she wrote. But to me, it's kind of, and I'm trying my hardest to stick to this content that I mean, to me, it's features are just kind of like these are the things that are never going to change, or only the developers can change, and push those out rather than having all these settings captured, picking out the ones that I do want to change. So I'm trying to do what he says, but it's I don't know, like every week you find something new with content management. I don't know. Either we're doing it very, very wrong, or
No. The config is like it's an all or nothing sort of thing. And then config ignore is a little bit
I
of
don't know. I'm just I'm
Does he
wondering.
not want to maintain it anymore? Or
Sorry?
does he not want to maintain it
I mean,
anymore?
he's fine that helps.
Yeah.
Let me find it for you, actually.
Like, I mean, features and everything, and it's telling
Have a
everyone
pen.
don't use it. Like, if
You can just tell me
the
the-
wrong reason, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just wondering when I'm going to hit my breaking point. I'm just going to do more features.
Yeah. Now, features at some point he's going to stop supporting it.
Well, no, see,
And then-
his argument was that he originally built features for packaging features.
Yeah.
And people have started using it in Drupal 7 for just kind of packaging configuration.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Like, it just seems like so you can still do that if you wanted to. But he's telling people like, don't use configuration.
Yeah.
And it's just like okay, but then it should work a lot easier than it seems.
Then putting it in there, yeah. Because features is useful for bundling stuff.
Yeah,
When you
and
have it
I
all
mean, like I
bundled.
said, like if I have a config form and it's like, well, it doesn't matter, and then it doesn't matter if the editor changes the value either, because when you do a feature review, you're gonna like, oh look, these are the fields that got changed. Ignore that, right? So that no one's like changes accidentally just get blown away in one big blast when you
Yeah.
config.
The other approach is there's a module that we've used in the past. API key storage.
Yeah, I've tried that once. The problem with that one is, first of all, it still dumps the
Oh, it
keys out
does.
in plain text, and two, what happens is you have a config form, and say you have 10 values on the form, and one of them is the key. Now, when you enable this module, so now again, somebody other than the developer goes in and needs to change the key. What they don't know is that changing that field on that form now doesn't do anything, because that field is now overridden and managed in the key management. So they need to know, like, hey, on this form, that 10 field, you don't change it.
Yeah.
You have to go into another set of the configuration screen to change that field. And there's again no indication. I mean, what should happen is that field should get disabled or
Yeah, that's right.
something like that.
That's right.
It just becomes a lot for people to remember about where these values actually live.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, even after all of that, when you do like the damn key module still dumps everything in plain text, which doesn't help.
Yeah, that's a tough one, the key management piece of it. Now, I guess what you could do is create it as an entity, and then hash it like a password hash. That's not in
It's
the
a lot
div.
of, like, I mean, all the config form, takes 5 seconds.
Yeah,
Custom
exactly.
entities.
And you have all those nice
Yeah.
dumps and everything.
And I don't know, from my problem was got identified by our network guy who was actually doing the first staging deployment. He's like, hey, you have all this secret information.
It's like
Config rewrite.
config rewrite. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm trying to figure that out.
I think the encrypt modules separate that stuff out, right?
Yeah, maybe. I haven't looked at that one. I've used it for things. But the problem is that you just need one developer to get sloppy and add a piece
Oh, wait.
of config.
So you need 2 modules. Let me see if they actually exist. I'm curious if it's actually
Folder with thousands of other files.
org.
Could be in your Git repository.
Yeah. So you said the encrypt module configuration as well.
I'm not sure. I went to an encrypt talk, and that's what he was talking about. Is like keeping that stuff totally separate from everything. I haven't actually used it myself for this.
Yes, this is the one. Configuration rewrite.
Configuration rewrite? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so config rewrite.
It's good.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay.
And it'll have all the dependencies in there that
Okay.
it needs to pull in.
All
So
right.
this will do it. So I use it all the time for a lot of like configuration pieces. And this might actually be another approach. Also, you can write.
Thank you.
You could write a custom see, that's another custom module that you'd have to like include. But
I
it
have
would
a
be.
problem with the custom module. I mean, most of our stuff is custom. So we have a lot of pretty complicated workflows and stuff like that that's unique to our organization.
So
It's just really
this module here, configuration, it's a little bit like config split, where you put configuration in custom modules, or one custom module that has a lot of these configuration rewrites in it, and it adds it. So basically, but then that means you're still dumping it. If they were to dump it or do a configuration export, the stuff is still done. Yeah, that's right. It's still configuration. What are the API keys from? I guess I should turn this on.